Well, we are going to go ahead and get started, and as people trickle in, we'll be going through updates before we hit the main content for this evening. So, welcome everyone to San Diego Tech Hub, our monthly meetup. My name is Claude Jones, and I am the founder and CEO of San Diego Tech Hub. You know, I see a lot of new faces, or at least I should say names that are joining on the Zoom. So I thought I would take an opportunity just to provide an overview of San Diego Tech Hub and what we're all about, and share some of the impact that we've been making within the community over the last couple of months. So San Diego Tech Hub is a community, and it is a community of socially conscious professionals that are looking to drive social change. Now, the members of our community are called conduits, and we call ourselves conduits because we are connecting needs to opportunities, leveraging our influence, our knowledge, and our expertise to help cause change in other people's lives for the better. And so we are connecting businesses, nonprofits, educators, technology groups, all together through the different products, services, and events that we throw. And, you know, the theme that we have, or the model that we have here within San Diego Tech Hub, is all about connecting, informing, and empowering, you know, the individuals within our community. And I want to take just a few moments to talk about some of the impactful things that we've been doing over the last couple of months. So we've launched a new program, I would say about 3 months ago, called Hire Me. And the idea behind this program is about rehumanizing the recruiting process. And so when we think about recruiting as it exists today, 75% of resumes get rejected before they even reach a human. 2% of job seekers earn an interview with an actual person. And the average resume takes about 4 minutes to read, but on average, the review process takes about 8 seconds, people just skimming through that. And, you know, with this, you know, I guess, desire for efficiency, what's ended up happening is that it's dehumanizing the recruiting process. So now you think about individuals that are fresh out of college, people that are looking for a career transition, people looking to upskill. It's just difficult for them to get back into the marketplace. And this is where Hire Me comes in. We provide the candidates a free service we have some proven results, which I'll share in a bit, but we provide training strategies to help put candidates in the driver's seat. We actually provide free mentorship with real expertise to kind of help people get back into the workforce and navigate through the complexities of networking, and, you know, just helping to build confidence, which is the last point here, is that our goal is to make sure that candidates put themselves in the driver's seats versus the other way around. And, you know, for the last 3 months, I had mentioned, we've helped place over 13 people in jobs. We've helped train over 90 people through this program. And this is something free that we're just giving back to the community. And so this is just one example of San Diego Tech Hub, you know, leveraging the network to help create opportunities for others that are struggling or just need some help on navigating to get work. So that's one program that we have. And if it's something that you're interested in, or you might know someone that could benefit from this, go to sandiegotechhub.com, hire-me, check it out. And as we continue to sort of mature this program, there's definitely going to be some more things coming. But that's one thing that we're doing. Secondly, we're all about giving back and volunteering. And so we recently had a volunteer event, more to come this year, but we had a couple of our conduits come out and work with the food bank just to help deal and package up some food to help give back to other nonprofits that are dealing with food insecurities in the San Diego area. So it was definitely a great time. We had about 20 people show up. And just to be able to network, to do a good cause, and just see people, you know, in person, it was really great. So had a chance to do that. We also have our monthly happy hours. We have one coming up. So if you're in San Diego, September 14th, from 6 to 8:30, come on out. We're at Culver Brewing Company, and it's always a great time just to see people, network. $2 beers, you can't beat that. They have a great deli on site, serve some good food. But if you can make it out, we'd love to see you and catch up. But always a great time. So if some of these things are interesting to you and you want to figure out how to get involved, you can join the movement of conduits. You can connect with us on our Slack channel. We have a mailing list. The meetup is the great place to kind of get updates and invites on some of the things and events that we have. Connect with us on LinkedIn and Twitter. You can go to sandiegotechhub.com and go to resources, and it'll provide links on how to connect to each of these spots. So that's kind of the spill about San Diego Tech Hub and what we're all about. And I am extremely excited to introduce our keynote speaker for this evening. And when we talk about, someone giving back their time, expertise, and knowledge to the community, I think Michelle is doing just that. So I'd like to introduce her to the group, and then I'll turn it over to her to, help us break free from imposter syndrome. So Michelle Galloway is a former partner and currently of counsel to the Cooley Litigation Department and its IP group. Her litigation practice focuses on patent lawsuits, and she also works with companies, teams, and individuals on leadership and management skills. Michelle is a frequent speaker at conferences and companies, combining current scientific and psychological research with practical advice and humor regarding leadership and building high-performing teams. In addition to her practice, she is a lecturer teaching courses at Stanford Law School and a lecturer at Santa Clara Law School. She currently serves on the California Lawyers Association Racial Justice Committee and on the California Lawyers Association Litigation Section Executive Committee. She has a certificate in diversity and inclusion from Cornell and has taken courses related to neuroscience and leadership. So I'm extremely honored to have Michelle Galloway donate her time and expertise to our group. Michelle, thank you so much for being here today. And on behalf of the community, I can say that we are extremely excited to hear you speak today.
Well, thank you so much for the kind invitation to join you this evening. I do want to make sure that I emphasize I am a profound extrovert, and so doing this remotely, I find extremely challenging because I get my energy from interacting and hearing ideas from other people. So I do want to suggest that you can interrupt me anytime you want to. Sending a message in the chat, I'll be monitoring that, and that's a great way to pose questions or comments. And but please don't feel like you have to wait to the end. Absolutely happy to talk to you as we go on. So let me share my screen, which occasionally works when you go to do it. There we go. So imposter syndrome, I'll be honest, the first time I was asked to speak about imposter syndrome, I was sort of like, no, there's not great peer-reviewed research about it. It makes people think there's something wrong with them. And I was very reluctant to dive into the area. And I finally satisfied myself that what there is a lot of research about confidence and how it is projected and the things that undermine people's confidence. And I think that's really sort of at the root of imposter syndrome, is not believing that we are actually competent and capable of doing the work that we need to do. And so I want to encourage you tonight to sort of think about imposter syndrome and what it is. I do want to talk about what causes it, because I think it's important, if you're going to defeat it, if you're going to talk back to it, you need to understand sort of what it is that's causing it and how it leads us to two really dysfunctional behaviors, which is procrastination or overwork. So it really leads us to behaviors that in the workplace negatively correlate to other people's impression of us, but also rob us of our own health and well-being. Then I want to shift and talk about sort of confidence and why it's important and what that looks like, especially as we communicate with others. And I'm going to pay particular attention to what that means as we return to work, or for some of us, a more flexible world where some work will be online and other work will be in person, and why our brains are struggling with that right now. So hopefully give you some really practical suggestions that you can sort of use right away. Okay, so just questions for you to sort of ponder, or feel free to jump into the chat room and put your response. But does success correlate more with competence or confidence? Which do you think is more important to your success? How competent you are, or how confident people think you are? And so I see a lot of early responses coming in as confident, and that really is. I sort of often think of it, I like the people who are saying both. Being competent, being capable of doing your job is the price of admission, right? People would not have hired you. People would not have invited you to volunteer with them, to serve on their board, to help in a classroom, unless you were competent. But confidence is something that reassures the people around us that we're going to be able to do it. It gives them comfort. And so we need to find better ways to project that confidence without tipping the scales, as Chris has mentioned, to sort of self-aggrandizement, where you don't have the goods to back it up and you actually can be off-putting to other people. And then I think one thing also to think about is, did you expect to reach the level of success you've had in your career at this juncture? Like, thinking about where you are in your job today, did you think that's where you would be? And I think one of the things that often happens is that we are ahead of our skis, so to speak. We have reached a greater degree of success than we expected to. And so we're worried that suddenly something will fall out from underneath us and we'll be airborne. And so one of the things we need to do is recognize that we have the opportunity for constant professional growth, and not to look at that as something that we need to be worried about, that somehow we'll be shown to be incompetent because we've achieved too much too fast. So a lot of research suggests that our success actually correlates very strongly with confidence, because that's what other people perceive first and gets them comfortable with the idea that we're going to be working with them. So, competence, the price of admission, confidence, taking it to the next level in your trust relationship with others. Imposter syndrome was first thought of in 1978. That's when some research came out by Dr. Clance, who described imposter syndrome as a belief that you've fooled other people. So you've sort of tricked other people into believing that you're capable. And if you are successful, you attribute that to things other than your own abilities. So you tend to attribute your successes to external factors or luck. And you fear that you might suddenly be unmasked, that people will recognize that it was all a fake and you don't actually know what you're doing. Now, when you think of that definition, the question I always think of is, so you're so smart, you can fool everybody, but then they're going to find out that you're so smart that you fooled them. There's sort of something odd about imposter syndrome in the sense that on the one hand, we're worried that people are going to find out we're not as smart as we think we are. Well, at the same time, we think we've pulled the wool over everybody's eyes. And that's not a well understood piece of imposter syndrome, but certainly something to think about in terms of why we think we are somehow misleading the people around us about our abilities. If you have doubt, you could grab this link. I can drop it into the chat room for you a little bit later, but this is an online free assessment you can take that will let you know sort of where you are on a scale of feeling like an imposter today. It's not static. Many, many people feel like an imposter at some points in their life, but not necessarily continually. So this would be one easy and free assessment if you're interested in learning more about where you might be right now. So feeling you're inadequate, it persists over a period of time, and the fear that others are going to discover that you're not good enough. I think this, did anyone else lose audio? Oh, yeah, I think I'm still here. Awesome. Imposter cycle, I think this is a great diagram to illustrate how we can have that imposter syndrome, and it undermines the very foundation of what other people are looking for. So let's start in that upper left-hand corner. We get some task that we're supposed to do that's achievement related. So some work project that we need to do. And we then start playing a loop of self-doubt and worry. I don't know how to do this. I haven't negotiated this kind of agreement before. I've never made a presentation to a customer on my own. And so we start experiencing that anxiety and self-doubt. And it tends to lead people to one of two behaviors. There's a group of people, and you can identify yourself if you want, who over prepare. In other words, what they do is, I'm so worried that people are going to find out I don't know how to do this, that instead of spending 2 hours to prepare for this presentation, I'm going to spend 8 to make sure that I get it right. We put in all that extra effort of over preparation. That has consequences. It's keeping you from doing other tasks that you might have been assigned. It may be keeping you from your family or from social contact. And so when we go into that, I'm going to over prepare, that cost is both personal, but also costs our organizations and the people around us, because we don't have attention to give to the other things in our world. We put in all that effort, and then when somebody praises us and says, hey, Claude, great job, you did a fantastic job on that presentation, then we say, well, wait a minute. That's only because I spent 8 hours doing it. Nobody else would have spent 8 hours. They would have only spent 1, right? And so as soon as we've been given the positive feedback, we discount it, we deflect it, because we know nobody else had to work as hard as we did to make that happen. And that then feeds our self-doubt, and we start the cycle all over again. So it's a vicious cycle. It's eating away at our health and well-being. It's keeping us from connecting with other human beings and doing other important work. There's a different group of people, and again, you're not always in one or the other, but it's a different group of people who they get that task in that upper left-hand corner. They start having that loop playing about how, wow, I've never done this before. I might not be able to do it. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to get that presentation done. And so they avoid getting started, because if you started working on the presentation, other people might find out that you're a fraud. But if you just procrastinate, neither you haven't confirmed yet that you don't know how to do it, and nobody else knows it either. And so they procrastinate, they wait to the last minute, they pull together a fantastic presentation or analysis or whatever it is they've been tasked to do. The team praises them for getting it done. And then they discount all of that feedback because it was just luck, right? They just lucked into it because they waited to the 11th hour to do it. It could have easily gone the other way. And that procrastination has also wreaked havoc with our health and well-being and our sense of, security. And it's also negatively impacted others around us potentially if they were waiting on things from us, or it makes it so that they have to scramble at the last minute to provide their input. So we discount that positive feedback as that was all luck. And then that feeds into our sense that, well, I may not be able to do it again. That really wasn't, I wasn't really worthy of praise. And we just keep repeating this cycle. And so for me, I'm a very visual person. And so I think, this is the kind of diagram you can print out. I'll have an opportunity later on. If you're interested in the slides, you'll be able to request them. And what we tend to do is fall into one of these camps. And the thing that's really important is your brain's doing that to protect itself, but they're both maladapted. They are not helping you advance your career, and they're affirmatively harming your relationships with coworkers, with bosses, and with other important people in your life. So for me, this is just in a nutshell. And sometimes I have to look at it and say, where am I? Why am I in the over preparation mode? And just acknowledging, wow, I'm over preparing because I'm worried about this and I need to stop that. This presentation's only worth 2 or 3 hours of my time. That can then help us to pull back, because it lets us reframe, why am I in there, and understand where that's coming from. So some of you may find this really helpful if you print it out, to just look down every once in a while and say, why am I in one of those loops? I should be out of it. And really appreciate some of the things that people are posting in the chat, because I think all of us, and again, the idea that at some point have experienced this, not that it's perpetual. So, for most of you, you've probably experienced it. I'll give you some idea of what the data has to tell us in just a moment. But for most adults in the United States, the estimates are that about 75% of us at one time or another experience imposter syndrome. So who suffers from imposter syndrome? Extremely limited data. This is one of the things that makes me uncomfortable because I like to see peer-reviewed research before I go out talking and presenting to other people. Most of the estimates put it between 40 and 70% of the US population. I do not know what that data looks like for other countries. A lot of the research has been focused in academia, in nursing, and in librarians for reasons that still remain mysterious, although I have some speculative ideas about why that might be. Generally, researchers believe that people who are in creative fields may suffer from imposter syndrome more. It could be that people who are in creative fields are looking to see whether that creativity connected with others. And so they're more focused on that external validation, so to speak. There is a thought that millennials, so these are going to be people who are between, roughly, 26 and 40, somewhere in there, tend to suffer from imposter syndrome more than previous generations. And the thinking is that they are more prone to a fixed mindset being the book by Carol Dweck, Mindset, is where this originates, that they tend to believe that your intellect is fixed. And so things are more correlated to your raw ability than to your effort. And the name of the book is Mindset, literally just Mindset. Millennials also suffer from higher rates of depression than previous generations. And one of the things that may also contribute to their imposter syndrome is what's called compare and despair. Which means that in social media, think about it this way. Up until this generation of millennials, every generation in the United States has experienced a higher standard of living than the generation before them. So one way to think about this is if this is your expectation of where you're going to be in your career or your life, and you outperform that, you're doing better than that, then that's a measure of happiness, right? Because you're beating expectations. Now, here's the problem. If that's your expectation, what are you reading on social media if you're a millennial about where everybody is? Let's admit it. Everybody's lying on social media that things are much better for them personally than it probably is, or many of them are, right? And so those millennials are looking at other people. This was the millennials' expectation when they started. This is where they're reading that everybody else is, way off the chart, but their actual reality is down here. And that becomes a measure of dissatisfaction. And so that idea that they're constantly comparing how they feel inside to what other people are saying outside about how they're doing, that compare and despair really has a negative impact for millennials. And we expect to see that also with Gen Z. So it has some real consequences. The other thing that I think it's very important to acknowledge, I have a profound interest in diversity on all different measures. And there's a lot of research right now on first generation students. So people where they are the first person in their family to go to an institute of education beyond 12th grade. They face tremendous issues around sense of belonging on many college campuses, and the challenges of sort of persistence in the face of a lot of obstacles. And so we also see that first generation students are experiencing imposter syndrome at a higher rate. And so then the question becomes, will we continue to see that in the workplace? And I think this is one of these interesting areas where many workplaces are just starting to think about, hey, as an HR matter, what can we do with people who are entering the workforce in a different way as college graduates than people in their family before them? And are we helping them, especially to understand the unwritten curriculum? And I think that's also a big contributor to imposter syndrome, is there are a lot of unwritten rules in the workplace about how things are done, how an organization views conflict, how they make decisions. Is there a hierarchy? And that's challenging if you've never had that experience before. All of us are experiencing that right now in the return to work environment of either returning to the office or hybrid. because the rules got thrown out on March 15th of 2020, and we all pivoted to this idea of being online and working remotely. And now, as we start to have some transition to new ways of working, as some people go back to the office, all of us are feeling that kind of unsettled sense again, because the rules are unwritten. And that is especially challenging for millennials and first generations in the workforce. Doesn't mean the rest of us don't experience it, but usually we have more knowledge to fall back on, more experience to fall back on. Now, here's the really good news. If you have been posting, so I'm going to use Kathy as my example. Kathy says she has suffered from imposter syndrome. So Kathy, here's the really good news. That means that you perceive that your abilities might not be where you want them to be. But if we were to ask all of your colleagues, they would actually rate your actual abilities much higher than you think. There's actually a phenomenon called the Dunningkruger effect, where there are some people who have very low actual abilities, but they perceive that they're the cat's meow and they are outstanding, and they're shocked that the rest of us don't see it. So how many of you really have known somebody like that? They have almost zero actual abilities, but they have this inflated view of the contribution that they're going to make. I'd be shocked if every single one of us hasn't experienced that at some point. Yes, they become the boss. I think that's exactly right. Many of us have suffered from that. So just know, if you have had imposter syndrome, it's a distortion. It's a distortion of your perception of how you are versus those around you who may think that you're particularly talented. Now, I did see one person in the chat room who said, I've heard women suffer from this more. And that's a really interesting question, because there's no research that I have found that suggests that. In fact, I think it's more likely from the reading that I've done in research that women talk about it more, or that it is socially acceptable for women to acknowledge it to a greater extent, where it is not considered socially acceptable in some places for men to acknowledge that they have suffered from imposter syndrome. And that's sort of one of the things that I think is interesting, that so much of the research has been based on populations of librarians and nurses, which are two fields that tend to be female dominated. And whether that's created just sort of this myth that women suffer from this to a greater extent than men. So you're in good company. If you feel like you're an imposter, you are not alone. Sheryl Sandberg at Facebook. There are still days when I wake up feeling like a fraud, not sure I should be where I am. This one I've always loved, Meryl Streep and Jodie Foster. How many of you think Meryl Streep, fantastic actress, as is Jodie Foster? I mean, I could watch almost anything that they're in. Meryl Streep said, you think, why would anyone want to see me again in a movie? And I don't know how to act anyway, so why am I doing this? And she's won 3 Oscars, 21 Academy Award nominations. Jodie Foster, as she was getting her Golden Globes Lifetime Achievement Award, said, when I won the Oscar, I thought it was a fluke. I thought everyone would find out and they'd take it back. They'd come to my house knocking on the door. Excuse me, we meant to give that to someone else. That was supposed to go to Meryl Streep. So even people who are sort of at the top of their profession can experience this, because they're comparing themselves and how they feel inside to how other people are doing externally. Maya Angelou, one of the most, how many people on this phone call have won a Presidential Medal of Freedom? I'm not really aspiring to that. I don't think I'm likely to win one. I'd be shocked if any recipients are on this call. She's written 11 books, but each time I think, uh-oh, they're going to find out now. I've run a game on everybody and they're going to find me out. So even people who are sort of revered in their field can suffer imposter syndrome. And it is not just women. Tom Hanks has had several quotes out in the media about feeling like an imposter. And David Bowie's another person. So I don't want you to think you're alone. Many people have suffered from imposter syndrome. The real question is, what can we do about it? So what causes that sense of I'm not good enough? I'd ask you to think about this. Try to think about, is it that you're actually afraid you can't do the work? Or is it more that you're afraid people around you don't believe you can do the work. Because I do think there's a difference, right? There's a difference between thinking, I don't know how to do this and I won't be able to figure it out, and fear that other people don't believe that you're going to be successful. And so you may want to sort of try to parse that for yourself about which is the fear that's really dominating your thinking, so that you can choose appropriate strategies. Some causes of imposter syndrome: low sense of belonging. And I'm going to talk about each of these in a little bit different, in a little bit more detail. Societal expectations about how we are supposed to be in society, stereotype threat, and then cognitive distortions. So let me give you some examples of each of these. That low sense of belonging. I did happen to use gender to illustrate this. So for example, a college had a women in math panel to encourage undergrads to enter math, but they had only male speakers. So, you know, if you're a young woman listening to a bunch of male professors say, yes, women can be successful in math, how persuasive is that when you're looking around and nobody else looks like you? And obviously the same thing could be said on the basis of race as well, that for many people, when they look at a population of people who are talking about things, they're not seeing other people who come from their background, who've experienced similar things to them. And they may, as a result, they have that low feeling of belonging, feel more like an imposter, like somebody's going to find out that they don't deserve to be there. And the truth is, there is a lot of gaslighting. There is a lot of gaslighting about on both gender and race, trying to encourage, you know, that fosters that thinking that you're not like the others, and that therefore there's something questionable about your success. So this would be things like when people say things meant to, oh, you must be the diversity hire. Well, that's designed to get you to doubt yourself and whether you were hired on your merit. I actually think that's one of the most destructive things that people say to others, are things that make them question whether they earn their spot, so to speak. And so sort of that gaslighting, that's an example of that kind of gaslighting. Actually at one tech conference, because this was a tech audience, I wanted to really acknowledge that. All of the women who were lined up to give major talks were men. I'm sorry, all of the major talks were going to be by men. So women created an alternate tech conference, literally at a center right down the street, to have where women would be the primary speakers. And that's happened more than once. So there's a lot more attention being paid, for example, now to the composition of who's presenting at conferences and things like that. There's an issue of societal expectations. Just what do people, expect from you? And somebody mentioned earlier in the chat that often those are changing all the time. It's not always clear to us what people's expectations are. So I'll give you one example. In this study, they recorded both men and women sort of being the CEO presenting, and then they have men and women watch that video. And what's interesting is both men and women watching this hypothetical actor and actors playing the CEO who talked more than other people, they viewed the woman CEO as less competent and less suited to leadership. So this really goes to, I'll just have you, easy example. If all of you would just close your eyes. Think of a pilot. Open your eyes. How many of you thought of a Black woman as a pilot? And I think that's just an easy way to sort of recognize that one of the challenges is, as a society, if all we see are, for example, women teaching school until we get to college, then there can be a belief that only women teach, right? And that's just not true. And so until we get that, we start to recognize, why is it that we default? And the other example is often when you ask people, okay, close your eyes, envision a CEO, people think of a man and a white man, as opposed to all of the other tens of thousands of people who might be equally capable, but they're not male and they're not white. And so this idea of really stopping to think about societal expectations creates a lot of challenges for people in the workplace. Stereotype threat is also something that's extremely interesting, which is we tend to take on other people's baggage, right? So another person has a stereotype, but when we're reminded that we're part of the group about whom there is a stereotype, we tend to pick up that baggage. There's a great book on this. It's called Whistling Vivaldi. And anything I talk about tonight, if you're interested, you can drop it in the chat and I will really try to make sure that I answer them either tonight or follow up with you. But this will give you an example. Men and women do about the same on math tests. So in this particular test, they gave men and women sat down to do a set of math problems. And they do problems 1 through 12, and men and women score about the same. And so then the 13th question on the form says, are you, male or female? Obviously there's a lack of imagination there, that there's a much broader spectrum. But if it said male or female and people checked female, and then they do another, or they checked male and they do another 12 math problems, what do you think happens to women's scores after they are asked, are you male or female? What happens to people who checked female? What happens to their scores on the next 12 math problems? Up or down? Yeah, they go down. Now, did those women just suddenly get dumber at math? And the answer to that is no, they didn't. But what happened is they were reminded of a stereotype that is widely held in the United States, that women are not good at math. Now, many of you on the call are probably people who absolutely show that that is an untrue stereotype. But by 5th grade, the majority of boys and girls agree with the statement that girls are bad at math. So the leaky pipeline in the STEM fields starts by 5th grade, right? Same happens if you ask for race. Well, how do you know it's a stereotype, right? How do you know it's a stereotype about women that cause their scores to go down on the next 12 questions? So after the second set of 12 math problems, so first they asked, are you male or female? Do another 12. And then they asked what your race was. Are you Black, white, or Asian? And what they found is Asian American women, so that they could check they were women, their scores go down on the next 12. But then if they checked they're Asian, their scores went back up on the next 12 math problems. And the theory is that that's because they were reminded of a positive stereotype. And I'm going to use that word with extreme reservation, positive stereotype, because stereotyping in and of itself suggests that we are using shortcuts to think about people. And if the stereotype is that Asians are good at math, then they're reminded of that, their scores go back up. So that's sort of considered the proof that it's the stereotype that causes this phenomenon. So if you stop and think about that, how many standardized tests have the people on this phone call taken over the course of your lifetime? And those tests have helped you get into college, decided if you got scholarships, might have decided what your starting salary was. And the questions that they asked at the start of almost all those tests were, what's your name? What's your age? What's your gender? And what's your race? And the very data they were trying to find out, what were the differences based on race and gender, they were actually changing people's scores, literally changing people's scores, because it reminded them of stereotypes held about them. And so one of the things that some of the more current testing does is they put all those demographic questions at the end. So you actually take the entire substantive exam, and only after you've answered all the substantive questions are you asked for that kind of demographic data. So a stereotype, real threat. And the other thing is the monkey mind. How many of us think we have to be 100% certain? There's only the right answer and there's wrong. There's no, there's no curve. Perfectionism. I'm not allowed to make any mistakes. Over responsibility. I'm responsible for everybody else's happiness and safety. And these form a mindset that just feeds anxiety and worry, which contribute then right into imposter syndrome. So, this is sort of, one of the things that we have to contend with as well is these cognitive distortions. I think perfectionism is self-abuse of the highest order. And I really look at this picture on the right and say, this encapsulates so much of what's troubling is why is good enough now considered failure? Good enough is an important, concept. And often we're not good at stopping at good enough. And we keep going. That's that overwork that we talked about earlier. So things you beat yourself up for, stuff that's out of your control, stuff that everyone has literally already forgotten about, and then stuff that nobody else even noticed. And so we spend a lot of time and worry on things that other people was out of your control and other people couldn't have dealt with it anyway. So you might ask yourself, what do you remember more, your successes or failures? And I suspect most of you, I can tell you exactly where I was when I lost the one and only jury trial that I have been on a team that lost. We tend to focus on the negative. The human brain is hardwired to notice the negative as a survival instinct, because back on the savannah, knowing when things were threats was really important. And you didn't want to make the same mistake twice, because often those mistakes were fatal. So our brains are actually hardwired for the negative at a ratio of about 5-1. So we tend to notice those failures a lot more. The costs are high, right? So the cost to us, we've talked about high criticism, low self-esteem, low self-compassion. For companies, it's a constant leak of people not getting to do the work that we want them to do because they're in this cycle of overwork or procrastination. It can lead to low motivation and engagement. It can reduce collaboration, and it can have negative health consequences, both physical and mental, for our employees. Stop and ask yourself, how many people are you suffering from burnout, and or how many people that you work with are suffering from burnout right now? And is part of that because we're constantly in this cycle where the imposter feelings are causing us to engage in these maladaptive behaviors. So what I want to do is push on to sort of knowing that, what are some things we can do, both as individuals, but also to push back. If we're managing other people, how can we sort of help them? And so I think one way to think about it is, what I want to do is project confidence so that other people know that I'm going to be able to act. And I think that's one way to think about it. Confidence is not about bragging, but it's about conveying to others that I will achieve what I'm setting out to do, right? That's what I'm going to achieve it. I'm going to act. Instead of being paralyzed in the, I'm just dreaming about doing my work, I'm actually going to do it, and you're going to get it. You're going to get it on time. I do think it's important to acknowledge that there is a difference between men and women. One of the major things that's different, there are many actual biologic differences between men and women. One of those is that women's brains do not produce as much serotonin as male brains. And serotonin is the chemical that sort of tamps down your threat detector, calms the brain. And so women's brains just don't produce as much of that chemical as it does for men. Columbia has studied confidence, and what they found, or they've coined the phrase honest overconfidence, that men are just overconfident. And that may be a factor of having more testosterone and more serotonin. So one of the ways they did this, for example, is they had men and women take a math test. And a year later, they asked people, remember that math test you took, how did you do? And men overestimated how high their score was by 30%, right? So they really overestimated their performance by almost a third. Women overestimated how well they had done on the test by about 15%. So I kind of looked at that and I thought, well, that's interesting. But here's what's really interesting. Then they said to the men and women, get into teams, and you're going to pick one person from your team to represent your team in a math competition, right? And it's sort of winner takes all. The person from your team who represents you goes, they do this math test, and if they win, then you're going to get you're going to get a whatever it is, valuable prize. And so what they found was when the men and women were talking about how they did on the first math test, so right, they're negotiating over, it's like Claude and I are negotiating, who's going to be our representative? Is it Claude, Peter, Is it, Emma, or is it me? And we're negotiating on that. It turns out that both the men and women lie about how well they did on the previous math test, trying to get it, but men lie to a greater degree, right? So both men and women lied the same amount, and said, I did much better on the test, but men exaggerated how much better they did on the test by a greater degree. And the result was that even in that negotiation, women are selected. So if you were picking based on who actually got the highest score on the test, you would expect women to have been picked about 50% of the time, but women were selected to represent the group 33% less often than their abilities would have suggested. And likely that is because of either implicit bias by teammates, or because of they're not projecting that same level of confidence about how they did on that test and how they would do in the competition. So how are we going to do that? A couple thoughts about communicating confidence, whether you are in person, so maybe it's a presentation, it's a Zoom call, it's an in-person meeting, or maybe it's by email or communicating in some other written channel. And what we would say in the United States, again, this is going to vary cross-culturally, but if you were in the United States, the preference that men and women have is for people who start with their conclusion and then describe how they got there. The irony about that is that it tends to be true that on a gender basis, men tend to start with their conclusion and then say how they got there, and women tend to tell the process they went through and end with their conclusion. And the problem with that organization is it often leaves the person listening to you or reading your email thinking, did they come to a conclusion? Do they know what they're doing? Are they expecting me, to step in and tell them what the right answer is? And so it raises questions about, are you competent? Why are you telling me all this thought process? I want to know the answer. So just a simple thing is start with the answer. And one of the reasons that's so important, especially in the written word, is that people are deciding whether to open your email and respond based on the subject and the preview screen, which is 2 lines. So having that conclusion right up front is really critical to people getting the key piece of information, even if they can't open your message, and to getting them to open the message. Because if they read that conclusion and they want to understand how you got there, then they can read the rest of how I got to this conclusion. So start with your punchline. Really think about the words you use. So starting sentences in a meeting or in an email, when you start with a sentence with I think we should lower the price. Are you really the subject of that sentence? You are not. The subject is really about the company's product and the price of that product. So if you're starting sentences with the word it tends to stand for the word indecisive. You look less decisive because usually the word I is followed by I think, I feel, or I believe. But the real place the sentence starts is after that word. I think we should lower the price. Just say we should lower the price. It's much more forceful. We tend to downplay our qualifications. So do you ever say, I'm not an expert, but I've tried to completely eliminate that from my vocabulary. Anytime I hear that, I'm like, seriously, you went to school, you worked really hard. Do not downplay your qualifications to other people. Do not downplay your authority, like you don't have the authority or ability to make decisions. Really try to avoid indirect or hedging language. I think it might be possible to. So get a little heavy-handed with yourself, because these are common. It's like throat clearing, like you're saying those phrases while you're thinking of what you want to say. Better to be silent than all these lead-ins that tend to undermine how you're projecting to others. And then finally, apologizing. I think this is a huge one. Stop and ask yourself, have you apologized for something in the last 7 days over which you had no control? And the reason I bring this up is I remember coming in to speak at a conference one day. And as I came in, the person said, I'm sorry, it's raining. And my first thought was, wow, you're super powerful. You can make it rain. There was no reason for that person to apologize to me because it was raining. They were ready for me. They, had a place for me to leave my coat. But it just really struck me that day how often we apologize for things we have no control over. So I think apologies are really important. Let's face it, please, thank you, and I'm sorry are 3 phrases that provide the lubrication for human relationships. And if something is your responsibility and you blew it, an apology is appropriate. But we diminish that when we apologize for things that we have no control over. And actually, Gmail has a plugin called Just Not Sorry that will tell you how much you're apologizing. Let me give you one hint in all of these. It takes 28 days to create a new habit. Don't try to do these all at once. So for like 1 month, I went around with the word I with a circle around it and a slash through it on the top of my notepad, so that when I was talking in meetings or in one-on-one conversations, I would remind myself, don't start your sentences with the word I. And so I think this is really important. Don't try to do them all at once, but take one and then work on it. So, and I've spent usually a month on both the first one and the second one in particular. And don't forget nonverbal communication. And all of us got a great lesson in that with the online world. 45 to 95% of what we convey is through our body language. It's not our words. And that's one of the reasons the brain doesn't like all these video conferences, because we are aware that we are missing really important nonverbal cues. So I think that that's really important to remember, that we also need to think about how we show up in terms of projecting confidence. And one of the most important things is not taking a seat at the table. One of the phenomenon, for example, if you've ever observed a room, you'll see a lot of young people will take seats against the side of the room, and so will a lot of women. And it's like, why are you doing it? You're on the team. You should be at the table. You don't have to take a second seat. And so really important that we think about how we are projecting. The other thing is self-promotion. Now pause and ask yourself, if when I said self-promotion, the first thought you had was that's bragging, and bragging is bad. Bragging is not bad. How many of you can remember what you wore last Thursday? And the answer is probably none of you, right? We tend not to remember those things. Why would your boss remember what great thing you did 6 months ago when they go to do your review? And so one of the things we need to do is get better at self-promotion. And that doesn't mean bragging. By the way, if you're an introvert, there's a great book on self-promotion for introverts. So self-promotion is about owning our success. Don't deflect it. So focus on the substance, right? So it'd be letting somebody know what happened, and then focus on how it promoted or advanced the organization's goals. If we had been live, I would have asked you to do the following thing, okay? What I would have done is, if we were in a real event, there's usually a networking component before things get started. And then at this point in the presentation, I would have asked people to raise their hands. How many people before the event started talked about something positive that happened to them at work? And almost no one raises their hands, right? People talked about their kids, where they live, made small talk about where they worked, but they rarely share anything that's positive about what happened at work. If you were to turn to somebody right now and say, hey, my name's Michelle, how are you doing? If Claude were to answer, I'm doing well. I just arranged this, conference, and we had 100 people who came to our meeting. It was super interactive. There were some great comments that were made. I think we learned a lot. And then at the end of that, Claude's going to say, and how are things going for you? It invites people to then respond by saying something positive that's happening for them at work. I think that's a really important pivot that a lot of us can make, because simply saying something short and accurate, I got a customer to return my call. I found that bug that needed to be fixed. It doesn't have to be a huge thing, but there's research published in the book, The Progress Principle, where they correlated people's assessment of how their day at work went with sort of entries about what they did. And they found the single biggest contributor to a good day at work was feeling like you made progress on something. And so really encourage you to start thinking about self-promotion as these small acts of just stating what you did instead of focusing on what didn't go well, or what drives me crazy. How many of you have conversations all the time that are about how competitively busy you are compared to everybody else? I'm busy. I've got all this to do. Oh my goodness, I'm so much busier. When did that become something to compete over? So just a quick question. Think about a promotion. So somebody writes up, here's the job description. What percentage of the job description do you have to meet before you apply for the promotion? So think about that. Women apply for a promotion when they meet blank percent of the job description. Men apply for a promotion when they meet what percentage of the job description? Okay. And here we go. HP in their research, when they were wondering why they didn't have more women in leadership, found that men apply for jobs when they meet 60% of the job requirements. Women apply when they meet 100% of the job requirements. And the difference there is men know there's a negotiation, that you have to meet some of the requirements, but some of the requirements, they maybe are flexible, maybe it's something that you could learn on the job. And so one thing I'd encourage, I think one of the problems with imposter syndrome is thinking that everything is set, like you've been dealt your cards and that's all you have. And the answer is that's not true. Much of life is a negotiation at work for the resources that you need and for what the finished product needs to look like. And so if you're coaching somebody else, I think this is an area where sometimes you got to nudge people. Like sometimes I've seen that, Peter's really ready for a promotion, but he's not putting his hat in the ring. Then one of the things I can do is say, you're ready for that. Oh, well, I don't meet all the requirements. You don't need to. You need to meet most of the requirements or the most important requirements. Even if you don't get it, you're signaling that that's where you think your career is headed. Going the wrong direction. A couple other thoughts. Show up at the meeting. There are expectations. And often people, there's a great quote in one of the books called, the quote is, meetings are where careers go to fail. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. So really making sure in meetings, we can state things in an assertive manner without qualified language. And you don't have to be 100% certain before you decide to share an idea or comment at a meeting. The other thing, and I think this has been a particular challenge in the online world, and now as we go into these kind of hybrid environments, is that context matters. Those moments of small talk before meetings and after meetings are how we start to build rapport and trust with other people. How we sit at the meeting, were we giving it our full attention? Were we prepared? I think also really important, and important to remember that the conversation isn't personal. It should remain focused on the substantive decisions and information that the team needs to share. A couple of other tips as we wrap up. Name that feeling. So keep in mind that the older part of your brain is the part of your brain that causes you to detect threats in the environment, your amygdala. The prefrontal cortex, the younger part of your brain, is the thinking brain. You cannot be both in the amygdala, trying to decide if things are a threat, and in your prefrontal analytical brain at the same time. So one of the things is when you're having one of these thoughts is to really challenge yourself, right? Challenge yourself about what's your evidence. I'll never be able to do this. I've never done a presentation before. Well, what's your evidence for you're never going to be able to do it? You've done hundreds of presentations to get yourself through high school and college. So I think this is one thing, is what's your evidence to support that little voice giving you that negative message? Is there any evidence to support it? What would your best friend say about that evidence? You know, sometimes my best friend would just tell that voice, you need to be bitch slapped. Like, you're not telling the truth. So really important. And then what would my mentor or sponsor say about that evidence? Would they agree with that? I do want to sort of address the comment I saw coming up in the chat there about this is really hard for introverts. Absolutely. A couple of thoughts for introverts. One is, if you can get your team to do agendas in advance so you know what decision needs to be made at the meeting, that can sometimes be very helpful so that you have that chance to prepare your thoughts in advance. I actually do that in my law school classes. I actually give my students questions for class discussion ahead of time so that they can think about them and be ready. As if you're an introvert, you might volunteer to run the meeting because that gives you the space to call on people, so to speak, or direct people about what it's time to move on to the next topic. It's often easier for introverts to be ready to volunteer right at the beginning of the meeting, because one of the problems for introverts sometimes is it's really hard to interrupt other people. And that's especially true of Americans, because we leave extremely little time between the time Claude stops talking and I start talking. In other countries, there are more seconds of time in between. And so for a lot of introverts, it's just hard to jump in and find that space where they can get in, and doing so right at the beginning of the meeting when somebody first says, what do you think? That's often a prime time for introverts to be able to do it when they don't have to feel like they're interrupting. So just a couple of thoughts of things you might try, and I encourage you, if there's others, to do it. I think the interruption point's great. I actually tell people in a lot of my talks, I have to really monitor that because I'm an extrovert. I'm interrupting because I'm so excited to be sharing ideas and exchanging that with each other. And so I have to make a real conscious effort to dial that back so that the introverts on my team have the space to actually participate. And I think that's an important lesson for a lot of managers, because over half the population are introverts. What are some other things that you might try? Shift your mindset, which we talked about that book, and I think that's really great. And understand a lot of things are opportunities to negotiate, to align your expectations to the expectations your boss or your team have, to inform how a decision is going to be made, to ask for additional opportunities and resources to be brought to bear on a project. Grit is another way to think about that. Have a growth mindset and more optimistic self-talk, and then you'll have the perseverance to get through the project. Quit deflecting compliments. I'm going to use a personal example on this one. How many hundreds of talks have I given where people come up and say, that was really great, or that was really helpful? And my response is, it was nothing, or it was my pleasure. Let's take the it was nothing. It wasn't nothing. I read 80 books. I probably read 150 peer-reviewed articles. I put it into a presentation. I thought about ways in which I might engage with the audience. Why is it that I deflect the compliment? Because my mom taught me, when you get a compliment, you're supposed to say 2 words. Thank you. Why is that so hard? So that was actually my goal for 2018. My professional goal for the year was to quit deflecting compliments and say thank you. And I was helped by a lot of my colleagues who, when I acknowledged that was my goal, would deliberately pay me compliments to try to trip me up, so that they could sort of laugh at me. But I'll tell you one other thing that really happened. I was talking to a group of young attorneys, and when I was sharing this, one of the young attorneys was like, I'm so glad to hear you say this, because I want to be able to do presentations the way you do, and I'm working super hard at it. And every time you said, oh, it was nothing, I thought, why am I not able to do it as well as she does yet? And I was like, oh my gosh, that is totally not the lesson that I wanted younger people to take. And that was a wound I was creating for people that I didn't need to, because of course it's hard work and you have to keep persevering to improve. So quit deflecting compliments. That's the first step in self-promotion, is don't deflect them, just say thank you. Talk back to that negative self-talk. And the most important way to talk back to negative self-talk, in my view, the easiest one, is to say yet. Add a yet. I don't know how to do this yet. I've never done a presentation to a customer yet. If I had a gift for you, I would just tag that word yet onto every piece of self-doubt that comes out of that negative loop that we have. By the way, I see that Jose, I think, says that I deflect compliments because achievement is more of my team. Here's the secret about that. What you say is, thank you. It was a really challenging project, and I was so fortunate to be working with a great team of people. So you can still accept the compliment that is for your piece and share it with the team, but don't just deflect it immediately to it was a team effort, because that diminishes the contribution that you made in the eyes of most people hearing it. Get a wow file. I call mine an Attagirl file. Some people call it their wow file. Make notes, write down compliments that people pay you. When something goes well, jot that down. It doesn't have to be really long, but it's going to help you a lot when you do your self-evaluation for your next review, because you're going to remember some of the things that you accomplished. And if you want to expand that, when you achieve something or a project goes really well, write down what were the challenges and obstacles you had to overcome. And how did I feel about that? And when you need a reminder because you're having a particularly challenging time, go back and look at it, and certainly look at it to do your self-evaluation at review time. So have a wow file. Be more compassionate. How many of you have said something to yourself? Really ask yourself, how many of you have said something to yourself that you would never say to another living human being? And I would expect almost all of us have done that, because we bully ourselves much more than anyone else bullies us with the negative self-talk that many of us have. And we need to get better at acknowledging that we should speak to ourselves the same way we would speak to our family members and our friends, without judgment, without disparagement. So self-compassion, and Kristen Neff has a brand new book out on this as well. Really highly recommend her TED Talk as well. And then finally, to wrap up, I love the book, You Are a Badass. And one of the things it says is it's just as easy to believe we're awesome as it is to believe we're giant sucking things. So if you've got imposter syndrome and you're thinking that, you know, you're a giant sucking thing, it is just as easy to pivot and say, I'm awesome. And so really encourage you to think about that. So I do want to say, if you want the slides, if you want to see a worksheet or two on sort of how to talk back to negative self-talk, or a wow worksheet, you feel free to reach out to me. You can also reach out to me via LinkedIn. I'm going to just post my LinkedIn thing right. Whoop, that's not the LinkedIn thing I wanted. I'm just going to post my LinkedIn link right here. If you want to connect with me, you can see about future things I'm doing, or future talks. I'm happy to have you do that. Or you can reach out to me if you want to get the slides or worksheets on some of these. So I've been trying to address everything people have been bringing up, but I'm going to stay on the line for a few minutes. I'm happy if you want to unmute or put something in the chat room. I'm absolutely happy to answer any other questions people have.
Hey, Michelle. Oh, sorry. There was a question by Joseph right above Jose's question.
Okay, I may have missed it. If you've got it right in front of you. Oh, here it is. How does someone battling imposter syndrome maintain a sense of confidence when entering an inhospitable or somewhat hostile environment? Yeah. So I think that's a really tricky one. I think for a lot of people, having a mantra does help. Some buzzword that you like to use that reminds you of what your game plan is. And I often think, root that in, I need to own that I'm competent and not worry about you have no control over what other people think. So I'm a big believer. There's a lot of research that says when we're just thinking about things, it can be really hard to switch to the positive, because the brain is hardwired to focus on those negative things. So a lot of times in a situation like this, you might just grab a piece of paper and ask yourself, what do I have control over? I have control over my preparation. I have control over the fact that I am the first person to do this. I don't have control over what people will think or how they will react to the presentation. And that can help you. I think that the act of writing gets us, if you're writing, you're in your prefrontal cortex. You're not doing that in that older part of the brain that is thinking about all the threats. And anytime you sort of draw that line and divide out what I know and what I don't know, or what I control and what I don't control, you're again staying in your prefrontal cortex, which is the thinking brain. And that's where you can get that feeling of calm. And my job is to go in there and just calmly explain the rationale for this decision. And you can't be worrying about the threat. You can't be in both parts of the brain at the same time. So anytime you're writing things like that down, it helps you get into the prefrontal cortex. But it's really challenging.
That's really, really helpful. Can I ask a follow-up? Is that okay?
Oh, absolutely.
So this comes from several experiences I've had, but one is entering a boardroom where folks don't frankly look anything remotely like me.
Yeah.
And seeing the judgments and then noticing the difference in tone.
Mhm.
Um, repeating the buzzwords makes lots of sense. How do I continue to at least project that sense of calmness, even
Yeah.
confidence?
I think I think it's very hard. I'll give you one other tip besides the mantra.
Mhm.
Maybe I'm revealing too much, but I think also a lot of times I'll take little stones that have a word written on it. That's something I want to focus on and just have it in my pocket, because you can touch that during a presentation or when somebody's getting irate, to just remind you, my touchstone is to just be factual, or my touchstone is to just be calm. So that might be another technique. I do think it's really challenging when you know that people's reaction to you is different, and you know that it might be because of some innate trait that you have that you think they're making judgments about. So I think that's really challenging. There's a lot of research that people who use strong visual imagery, that can be really helpful. So for example, I used to think of as a lawyer, right? My suit was my suit of armor. No, it's like Teflon coating. Like before you go into what you know is going to be a challenging situation, have a strong visual image of spraying yourself with Teflon. Anything they say can't stick to me. It can't touch the person that I am. It can't touch my values. That might be one way to do it, for example. So I think strong visual imagery of how I'm going to feel when I'm standing up there, how I'm going to look, where am I going to stand? Those are the kinds of things that can really help you. Because it's almost creating like a muscle memory kind of effect. So going to the boardroom before the meeting, taking a look, making sure you know where you want to be, having that sense. The other thing is always breathing techniques work, because when you take in 2 deep breaths, you are convincing your body that you have enough oxygenated blood to either fight or flee. And so even just the thing, I've gotten to the podium and I'm setting my papers down and taking 2 deep breaths before you start, have the effect of calming that amygdala, because your amygdala now thinks we're ready to deal with any threats.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
So I think that's strong visualization beforehand and some simple breathing techniques. And I'll give you one, I have no scientific basis for it all. Have an awesome playlist for those moments. If you've got your own personal fight song that you play just for yourself beforehand, I think that can also be like a powerful reminder and image for you to hold on to.
Thank you very much.
Michelle, there's another one. What's the alternative to saying I?
Well, most of the time, it's just starting your sentence. So I notice it a lot when I'm writing emails. I think that we should do X. I believe that because Y. And those sentences really should start with, we should do X because answer. So a lot of times when we start with I, we get tempted to use those I believe, I think, I feel, when really we're making a declaration that this is what should happen. And so it's really, in my view, most of the time, just about deleting those first 3 words off the sentence. It's sort of like a verbal, almost like a verbal tick, but I notice it especially in people's written communications.
Michelle, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Yes. So thank you so much for the presentation. My name's Susan. I had an aha when you talked about the causes and like low sense of belonging, societal, all of those. And my aha was, I'm the little sister. There's a 10-year gap between me and my sisters. And so I distinctly remember, as a child and even as an adult, my opinions have never been validated. My thoughts, my feelings, because I'm always the little sister, right? So I wonder if that is potentially where some imposter syndrome feelings can resonate from. And if you've come across any work or reading or things like that, which also suggests, you know, continuous dismissal of feelings or thoughts, especially as a child, can lead to this imposter syndrome.
So I haven't seen anything in the research that I've looked at that ties imposter syndrome to that kind of childhood experience. But I think it's certainly, I think that's certainly seems logical to me, right? That could flow from that. And I think it feeds that loop that what I say isn't valued, or what I say must and think must be wrong, because otherwise people in my family would have listened to it, right? Because they're the first people we turn to and sort of trust. So one of the things I think is particularly important is to think about it from the perspective of what would your best friend say?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And
like reframing it from somebody other than my family, like feed that thought from someplace else.
And so I think, again, you know, the fact is it was that way in your family, but that does not mean that that's true. And I think this is one of the things, my best friend has a saying that I think is really important, which is your feelings are just feelings. They're not necessarily true. And I think imposter syndrome is about having feelings. I feel incompetent, even though that's not true. And so really, literally, you know, I find this a lot when I'm working with somebody who is really struggling with anxiety, is when they express something that they're anxious about, and what's the evidence that supports that? You know, what's the evidence that makes you think that you aren't going to be able to get an A in this class? And, you know, it can be really helpful to sort of gently challenge yourself and, you know, challenge others if you're helping somebody else. And I think best friends have a tendency to do that. You know, they'd be like, of course people should listen to you, you're brilliant. And that last book that I had in the slides actually talks about that. You know, when we are on our insides, we're thinking about how we're doing based on our feelings, which might not be objectively true. And we're aware of all the mistakes we've made along the way. The great thing about reframing it by thinking about what would my mentor say, what would my best friend say, is they're not wedded to all your baggage, right? They don't know what mistakes you've made. You know, they may know some of them because they might have been with you when you made some of those. But it's that idea that they are looking from the outside and don't have all that additional internal baggage that you've spent a lifetime accumulating, that's distorting your thinking about your real ability.
I got you. Yeah, that definitely makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. So Claude, I know we're coming up on time and I want to be respectful of that. I appreciate how many people have stayed on, and I'm happy to continue up until 7 o'clock if people have more questions. Or as I said, reach out to me afterwards. I'm absolutely happy. You can call me. I'm happy to talk to you.
Thanks very much, Michelle. Really appreciate your time.
Well, I'm happy to be with everybody tonight, and I look forward to a day when I could be there in person.
I will have to say, on behalf of the community, as we're rounding down, this has probably been one of the most powerful sessions that we've had this year. You know, I know Lisa, who runs sort of our events committee, you know, had mentioned to you when I read sort of your bio and just the abstract to this, I knew this was something that the community could definitely learn from. And I will say just exceeded expectations with just the references, just the knowledge. I've learned so much, and I'm actively taking notes here, and I just think it's been great. And I just really appreciate you taking the time, you know, out of your busy schedule to come and speak with the community. And just thank you so much.
Well, absolutely my pleasure. And, you know, everybody should remember you're a badass. And I saw somebody put that right in the chat, Claude, that you're a badass. So
thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Have a good night, everyone. Thank you again, Michelle. I really appreciate your time. All right. Bye, all.